In order to learn about my ancestors, I often need to research the documents of people who enslaved them and kept them as property. This is the first page of the plantation cash book of James Gwynn, who received several of my ancestors as a wedding gift from his father-in-law, Thomas Lenore. At Mr. Lenore's death, he received several more. Fort Defiance was built at the site of an old Native American fort in about 1788 by Thomas Lenore's father, William. At least 2 generations of my family were enslaved at this place by several different families that once included 22,000 acres. My family members were enslaved by several different families who lived near the Lenores along the Yadkin River. My great-great-grandparents, Mellon Gwynn and Martha Hedspeth, were given land in Watauga County by her father, Richard Hedspeth, who had been free at least since 1840. These falls were referenced in the deed for Mellon's land. Mellon Gwynn had to sell that land for payment of a court judgment. He found work as a chef at a popular hotel, the Watauga Inn in Boone, North Carolina in 1896, and in 1904 had his own restaurant in Asheville, which took me quite by surprise because I moved here completely unaware of that. By 1910, Mellon Gwynn had died and his family were among millions of Black families who moved north in what is called the Great Migration. No photographs are known to exist of Mellon or his wife, but this is a photograph of Mellon's son, my great-grandfather named James Gwynn, with his wife Aquila Greenleaf Gwynn and children in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My grandfather James is in the center. I have no photos of my family's home, but this stair photo was taken from their street during the time they lived there. The other photo shows houses similar to theirs. The Black neighborhood was known as the Hill District. When I visited this area in the 1980s, the streets were still narrow and steep and the homes modest and aging. This is the former site of our family home on Howard Street today. It was demolished to accommodate an interstate. Of the neighborhood that remained, many of the families are struggling to stay as gentrification has priced many of them out of the area. I still have some cousins there and we see them when we get together for reunions. This is a photograph showing the red line maps used by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation that mortgage companies used to indicate where properties were uninsurable due to what they called Negro infiltration or other reasons they were deemed hazardous. These properties were ineligible for loans or mortgage financing, making homeownership difficult. This shows the placement of the interstate and other highways along with the location of my family's home at the red dot. Similarly, in Asheville, the Black Stumptown neighborhood was obliterated by Highway 240, the Burton Street neighborhood largely obliterated by I-26, and the East End neighborhood by Charlotte Street. On the left is my great-grandfather, Hampton Johnson of Wythe County, Virginia, the grandson of Thomas Jackson. Thomas was a slaveholder and bachelor who fathered at least 2 children by Edie Chafin, who was enslaved by widow Elizabeth Chafin, who lived next door. At least 3 of my ancestors from this area are descendants of the white men who enslaved them. Thomas Jackson is known for building the Jackson Ferry Shot Tower. Few of the records I have seen refer to the slave laborers that surely did most of the work involved. They mined the lead, hoisted it, melted and poured, and then scooped it from the water bucket where it landed and wheeled it out to the river for travel. Many of the wealthy slave owners of that area along the New River had their homes' histories cataloged as part of a WPA project. In each case, a history of the home along with a history of the family was recorded. These photos show the Thomas Jackson home still standing today and one of Widow Chafin's slave cabins, which is no longer standing. This was the home of my Johnson family, my grandmother's maternal grandparents. It was destroyed by fire many years ago. Grandma's mother, Addie Jane Johnson, died on the day she gave birth, but asked her mother-in-law to raise her daughter in New Jersey. She kept that promise, but also made sure to bring my grandmother so she would know her Virginia family. This is the farmland adjacent to the family home. Although many of the family members farmed, they also worked as laborers. And after the lead mines closed, they worked in the carbide mines until they also closed. My grandmother and I visited this site in the 90s, and a local shopkeeper took us to the site where this house once stood. Hampton's uncle, Rufus Jackson, and father-in-law, Charles Sales, were founders of the Red Bluff African Methodist Episcopal Church. At the time I took these photos in the early 90s, this church had no restrooms inside, but had an outhouse in the back. It was heated by a pot-bellied wood stove and still had the hand-hewn benches my ancestors made and sat on. This photo was taken in 2010 after an addition had been made to include restrooms and a wheelchair ramp. Many of my ancestors are buried in this graveyard. Although several of the headstones have fallen over, it's in better shape than some. Across the driveway on the right, there's another cemetery for white people. The South Asheville Colored Cemetery next to St. John A. Baptist Church in the Kenilworth neighborhood was started as a slave burial ground, and the land was later deeded to the church. Cemeteries have been a constant for many families who may not have owned their own homes, but a church and the burial ground where their loved ones are buried were constant. A former enslaved man named George Avery, who was a veteran of the US colored troops in the Civil War, was a caretaker of this burial ground. A lot of the knowledge of the burials was lost when he passed away, as he was illiterate. As the elders in this community passed on and other families have moved away, this cemetery had become very overgrown. In 2014, Warren Wilson College committed to helping restore the graveyard with the help of volunteers, of which I was one. Markers were preserved in place, even though they may have appeared to be simple rocks on the ground. The GIS map of the South Asheville Colored Cemetery shows nearly 2,000 burials, of which 1,963 have been identified. The boundaries have a new fence installed and the cemetery was rededicated, hopefully ensuring it will remain a place of homecoming and remembrance for African American families.